there are other things that can go into these goals than just, I want to create something that is helpful for these people who need it. And I think that a lot of it, especially in those earlier days, me creating this and being like, well, you can like it or not, and it's just to be helpful, was me holding myself back from showing up as an expert and me showing up as like, no, I know what I'm talking about. And these are great ways to do it. And you can also pay to work with me, right? I think a lot of times, especially as podcasters and business owners, it's easy to hide behind the, I want to be helpful and not actually have your business making money. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Listeners to Leads podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Galati. I am the owner of Galati Media, which is a full-service podcast management agency. And we help business owners launch lead-generating podcasts. So using their podcast to generate leads, grow their audience, land speaking gigs, and more. Today, we're going to talk about 10 things that I wish I knew before I started a podcast. Now, you've probably seen tons of these around, but mine are maybe a little different since I have launched 3 podcasts to date for myself. As a team, we have launched over 25 podcasts. Now, that is not to say how many episodes we have produced. We're at over 1,500 episodes at this point, which is crazy banana pants to me, but we've learned a lot. And I certainly, as a podcast host, have learned so much, not just about podcasting and the podcast industry and everything that goes into creating a lead generating podcast, but also about myself. And so some of these are going to be a mix of podcast industry things I wish I would have known, and also things about myself that I wish I would have known. So I started my very first podcast in 2018 after having listened to podcasts for about 3 or 4 years at that point. And at that point in my entrepreneurial journey, I was working as an inventory analyst for a small company, and I had over 7 years in manufacturing experience. And so I realized that there was a need in the podcasting industry for e-commerce small businesses. Now, my degree is also in marketing and management. I have a dual bachelor's, and I found that I could bring some of these concepts of marketing, of management, of strategy to these creative small businesses, as well as that inventory side and manufacturing side and everything that I had from my industry experience, right? So I could bring all of that knowledge to a podcast because I do not like showing up on camera. And I thought, you know what? If other people can do it, then so can I. And so I started my very first podcast, The Honest Product Bench, and that was in 2018. Fast forward to 2019, it was the end of the year, and I decided that I was going to pause my Honest Product Bench podcast and needed to just have some space. My mom had passed away that year, so I wanted to do something a little different. And I honestly didn't enjoy doing the same thing that I was doing in my day job for small businesses. But I had experience in the online space of creating podcasts, the thing I had done, blogging, social media marketing, all of these different things that go into creating a podcast that I thought, you know what, I could probably do this. Let me see if I can do this again. So it was the end of 2019 when I approached my sister and I said, look, I want to explore our experience of growing up in a cult. Do you want to launch a podcast with me? And she was like, I don't know. Let me think about it. And so in early 2020, we decided to launch our Two Sisters and a Cult podcast. Now, that is a very different podcast than my first podcast or this third podcast. but it taught me a lot. And how I approached that podcast was we didn't have any audience. We didn't have any followers. No one knew who in the world we were. And so I had to kind of start from scratch, and I still use the same strategies that I used then to launch our clients now. Giving lead time for marketing and getting excitement and having your listeners lined up like it's a huge sale day, excited for your podcast launch. And I learned so much from that second podcast that launching the third one was easy breezy. Now, for that second one, it got to a point where I probably could have kept going with the podcast, but we were talking about some really deep, very disturbing things. Obviously, cults are not enjoyable to talk about, especially when you've grown up in one. And so my sister said, look, for my mental health, I need to take a step back. And I respect that, right? Like that's an important part when you're going into a podcast co-hosting situation. You have to be open to the possibility that your co-host may not want to podcast anymore. And what will you do at that point? From there, I launched Galati Media after having lost my job due to COVID. And I decided that I was going to create a full service podcast management agency. And I knew that I didn't want to do it alone because I know how much time it takes to really edit a podcast, how much time and effort it takes to dig into it and edit it for content, and decided that, I'm going to grow a team. This is what I want it to look like, but I'm going to take those same principles of the things that I've learned from these two podcasts and apply them to my clients. And so we've been able to do that. It has been incredible, but we've learned so much. And after all of these years, we're going on 5 years now of podcasting, I definitely have learned some things. So here are 10 things that I wish I would have known before I started that podcast in 2018. And I believe that a lot of these are still applicable today, and I've tried to make sure that they are. So let's go ahead and jump right in. These are not in any particular order of how much attention I wish I would have given them, but they are all things that I wish I would have given some attention to. Number 1 is creating a goal and not being afraid to change that goal. I am type A. I am an Enneagram 1. I'm very rigid in how I go after things. Like there's one way to go after things and that's the way I'm going to go after it. And I wish I would have been more flexible with that goal and actually created a goal, right? So when I went into creating that initial podcast, the goal was just to create content that can be helpful. And that was it. And so while that's still a really valid goal, I should have had some more goals. Like, do I want to get clients from this podcast? Do I want to be known as a leader in the e-commerce space with this podcast? There are other things that can go into these goals than just, I want to create something that is helpful for these people who need it. And I think that a lot of it, especially in those earlier days, me creating this and being like, well, you can like it or not, and it's just to be helpful, was me holding myself back from showing up as an expert and me showing up as like, no, I know what I'm talking about. And these are great ways to do it. And you can also pay to work with me, right? I think a lot of times, especially as podcasters and business owners, it's easy to hide behind the, I want to be helpful and not actually have your business making money. Number 2, I wish I would have focused, like focus. There was an interview that I did in the early days and I honestly could cringe because it was a great conversation. Absolutely loved connecting with this person, have still been connecting with this person, but I asked a question at the end that had absolutely nothing to do with the direction that I wanted the conversation to go, and it wasn't valuable to my audience. And so that is something that I wish I would have taken out. I wish I would have just cut that off and been like, yeah, we don't need to have that question. As valuable as that question is for me and something I want to know, it's not really interesting to my audience, which leads me to number 3, which is your audience doesn't care until they do. I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. Your audience does not care until they do. Most podcast listeners are coming into a podcast that is new to them because a friend told them about it, they're looking for a specific topic, or they're kind of just browsing around. Those are usually the three ways that people find podcasts. And so you do not have their respect. You do not have their ears until you do. And so you have to create something that answers those questions, that entertains them in a way that they're looking to be entertained, to educate them on the topics that you are an expert in and to show that you're an expert in them. And that is what will allow your audience to actually care. Otherwise, they're going to start listening and stop listening. And at that point, you have not gained a new listener, and you definitely have not gained a follower. It's important that you remember that when you are creating the content, it's not just about talking into a microphone. It's about connecting with someone who has just found you, engaging with them, educating them, maybe entertaining them, and then encouraging them to stick around. You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. That is how you're going to be able to grow your podcast, because that person exponentially multiplies, right? They tell a friend who then tells a friend who then tells a friend, and it grows from there. So your audience doesn't care until they do. Number 4 is don't be afraid to start over or start fresh. In true type A form, I do not give up on things. And sometimes to my own detriment, where I will hold on to something that is no longer alive and no longer working for me because that's what I feel I need to be doing. And most of the time, all I need to do is just look at the data to tell me, why in the world am I holding on to this? This is not working for me. And so it's okay to start over. It's okay to start fresh. It's okay to refresh, right? So we have some clients where they have been podcasting for 3 years at this point, and they have gone through podcast refreshes where, they had been podcasting for about 6 months, and they decide, you know what, I kind of want to tweak my cover art a little bit. I don't want to change the whole thing, but I kind of want to tweak it. We have one client where she is coming up on 2 years of podcasting, and she is going through a name change. She's pretty much taking her tagline and turning that into her podcast title, because most people say, hey, isn't the name of your podcast this? She's like, no, that's the tagline. But hey, that kind of makes sense. It might work out that I change it to that, since people already think that that's the title. So we want them to be searching for the thing that is actually the title, right? So don't be afraid to start over. Don't be afraid to refresh, to start fresh, to take what you have created and shift it, or to just stop and start something that is really aligned with the direction that you're going. I believe I've mentioned this already on the podcast, but I did a strategy session with a podcaster. She's been podcasting for years, and she was finding that the podcast was directing people to her community, but were not translating into leads for her business. So I encouraged her to start over, to create a podcast that is able to showcase her expertise, is able to guide her audience, educate them in a way that is valuable and turns them into leads. And she did that. And within the first 10 episodes, she got a lead, right? And so if she had said, well, I've been doing this and I don't want to start over, I don't want to start fresh, I don't want to create a new thing, then she would have missed out on that connection, missed out on that lead. And that's where I think that it's so important to remember that when you go into something new, it's not actually something new. When you start a new podcast because your old one no longer serves you, that doesn't mean that you're starting from scratch. You have all of that experience under your belt at that point, and it makes it so much easier to launch that next podcast. Moving on to number 5, launch with purpose. When I launched my first podcast, I kind of just threw it out into the world and said, okay, everybody's going to just find it and they're going to listen to my podcast and it's going to be great. That is not how anything works. That is not how launching programs, courses, podcasts, YouTube channels, blog series, none of that works that way. And I think that it's so interesting and ridiculous that we think that it does, that we think that, hey, if I put this thing out into the world, build it and they will come. That's not, it just doesn't work that way, sadly. And when you launch with purpose, and when I say with purpose, I mean you are not launching your podcast like, hey, I have this thing, everybody come find it, okay, bye. That's not going to work. Or the other way that I see a lot of people do it is that they say, oh, something exciting is coming. I can't wait for you to see it. Something's coming. Whoo. Like, okay, this might sound blasphemous to some people, but I don't really care for Taylor Swift. But she does things like this, right? Where she will tease things or leave Easter eggs from places or capitalize certain things that spells out the title to her next album or whatever, right? Like, these are marketing strategies and tactics that she uses to keep her audience engaged and keep them on the hook. You are not Taylor Swift. You cannot do that, especially if you are someone who has a small audience. You do not have a cult-like following, and you can't tease, hey, something new and exciting is coming. People are going to be like, okay, scrolling on to the next thing. People don't care. Like I said, number 3, they don't care until they do. So when you launch with purpose, what I mean by that is that you intentionally get your audience engaged before the launch. Get them engaged with the podcast. I saw a client do this really well. She said, hey, if I were to launch a podcast, what topics would you expect me to talk about? Cool. That means that she not only has people commenting on her post to engage with it, she can then go back to that post and say, hey, Sally, I always use the name Sally in my examples. Too bad. Hey, Sally, I created a podcast episode on this topic. I'd love it if you would give it a listen, right? And so then it engages the audience back into the content rather than just leaving it at something's coming. Another way that I've seen clients do this is that they will have 4 graphics of their podcast cover art. Now, they already know which one they're going to go with. That's not the point of the post. The point of the post is getting the audience excited and engaged and saying, which podcast cover art do you like best? It doesn't matter what it is. They've already decided. Like, as a host, this is the cover art that it's going to be. This is why. But it gets people involved. And then you can go back and comment and say, hey, I picked this one. The podcast is live. I'd love it if you'd give it a listen. That's what I mean when I say launch with purpose. Now, we have a ton of podcast episodes specifically geared towards podcast launching. And we have a page on the website that is under guides and resources that is specifically for podcast launches. But here are a few episodes that are our top episodes on podcast launching. The first is episode 38, which is launching a podcast right for you? Episode 102, 10 things to do before you start a podcast. Episode 23, how to create a podcast launch plan. And episode 49, which is part of our tech tip series, launch a podcast. So those are things that'll help you with launching with purpose. Number 6 on our 10 things I wish I knew before starting a podcast, that it's not actually easy. And I added an LOL at the end of this because so often we're like, oh, out of blogging, YouTube channel, weekly lives, and podcasting, I feel like podcasting is the easiest, when really it probably isn't. But we get into it, right? And we get into this flow and this rhythm. And that is why the majority of podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. They don't make it past 25 episodes, is because it takes so much effort, so much thought, so much of yourself, and honestly being vulnerable on a show, talking to a microphone in your room by yourself, sometimes having a conversation with other people. But it's not actually easy. It doesn't matter how much research you do. You can only learn to do it better by actually doing it. I know that if I were to go back and listen to those episodes from my 2018 podcast, I would cringe and I would not be happy with the way that they turned out. I'm pretty sure there's one episode where I'm literally in the car driving to work. Don't do this at home. Not safe, but I'm driving to work, talking into a lapel microphone, sharing a story or sharing a step-by-step thing on how to do XYZ. Now, I did get some positive feedback from that episode, but there is no way at all that I would do that now, because I understand the importance of podcast audio quality and how it can make or break a podcast. And that would break my podcast. So it's not easy, but you have to learn by actually doing it. Number 7, it actually doesn't have to be perfect though, because if we're building on this, it's not easy. You have to do it. Know that those initial episodes are not going to be the best. Know that you showing up and being you is what your audience wants. They can listen to 10 other podcast episodes on your topic. Quite honestly, they could, but they're here for you and they're here for your take on that topic. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be you. You want your audience to be able to see you at a conference, hear you at a conference, hear you in a room full of people and say, I know her because the way she's acting right now is exactly how she is on her podcast. Number 8, use a style that works best for you. So this goes back to you did all the research, you've looked at all the different formats that you could possibly have your show be. But if you're feeling rigid, if you're feeling like, hey, I scripted this whole thing out and it's coming out robotic, how do you like to prepare for a talk? How do you like to present yourself if you're having a conversation with someone? Because that is what a podcast is. It is you having a conversation with one listener at a time. It is not, oh, I'm talking to the masses or I'm giving a presidential speech or I'm doing any of these things. It's not a keynote. It is literally you in the ears of your listener while they are going about their daily tasks and their daily lives. So when it comes down to creating a style that is going to be perfect for you, you have to think about that. Think about how you want to present. Is that with a fully scripted, reading it out format? Or is it something where you have to just have a bullet point list and riff and talk off the cuff? That's what I do. I personally cannot read a script because I know that it's going to be like, wah, 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 wah. That's exactly how I'm going to sound. And I don't want that. I want my solo episodes to be as if you were having a strategy session with me. And I'm giving you value and I'm giving you tips and tricks and ideas. And most of those tips, tricks, and ideas are off the cuff. I actually have a team member who she sat in on one of my strategy sessions. She was like, how do you come up with these ideas on the fly? It doesn't make any sense to me. I'd be like, oh, let me go do some research and I'll get back to you. And it's because that's just how my brain works. It's moving 1,000,000 miles a minute. And when someone presents me with a problem, most of the time I can say, well, here are some ideas and options and things that you can do to fix that problem. So use a style that works best for you and don't feel like you have to be scripted with your solo episodes. Now, if scripting out your solo episodes is the only way you're going to do it, then do it. I actually have an episode. We'll make sure that we link it in the show notes, but it is the power of having a solo episode and why solo episodes are so important in growing your podcast and growing your business. All right. We're coming to the tail end of these 10 things that I wish I knew before I started a podcast. Number 9, share it with people. don't be afraid to talk about your podcast. I was recently in a book club. It was a virtual book club, and I had my microphone out because I don't really like to use headphones, like the little whatever plug-in ones. I like using my mic, and I like using my over the head. And the person who was leading the book club, they have a podcast, and they had asked me, hey, do you have a podcast? Is that why you have a microphone like that? And I was like, oh yeah, I do. And they were like, oh, what is it called? And I was like, oh God, it's nothing to do with book club. It's nothing to do with this topic. I don't want to talk about my podcast, mostly because I don't really care for the sound of my own voice. I don't really go back and listen to my episodes, but people find a lot of value in it. So I was like, Listeners to Leads is the podcast. And they were like, oh, cool. And then they were like, oh my goodness, did you see Alicia's podcast? That's so cool. And I was just like, oh God, no, what is happening? This is getting out of control. And that's how I feel after 5 years of podcasting still. But if I want my show to grow, if you want your show to grow, you have to share it with people. You have to talk about your podcast. You have to say, hey, this is a major resource for my audience. This is a major thing that I'm doing and content that I'm regularly giving my audience. So here, have fun, right? Number 10, and I think this one, I know I said none of these are in any important order, but I feel like this one can make or break your show. And I wish I would have known to plan and to batch. And when I say plan and batch, I mean beyond the initial, hey, I planned out the first 10 episodes. I mean, really come up with a full plan, market research. We talked about that before on the show. We'll make sure we link to that as well. We do have a podcast episode that's titled How to Plan Out Your Next 10 Episodes or Your First 10 Episodes. There are so many ways to go about this, but you have to pick one that's right for you in planning those episodes. And I'm not saying you have to say, on this week I'm talking about this, and this week I'm talking about this, and plan it out months in advance, but have a plan. Maybe you do that monthly. Maybe you do that every other month, every 3 months, and you come up with what you're going to talk about over the next 3 months. And then you batch those. When I stopped podcasting that first podcast, the major reason was because I did not have episodes batched. Work got busy, life got busy, everything got really, really busy to the point where the podcast was not as important in my list of things that I needed to do. And so if I had batched episodes, I probably could have skated through that time. But instead, I was stuck with, I don't have anything to release this week. And I feel bad about that. And so now I'm not going to release the next week and the next week and the next week. And I'm going to kind of show up here, but it's not going to be consistent. At that point, it made more sense to just stop. And I don't want that for you. And so I wish I would have known about that before. And I was able to actually implement that in the spring of this year. So now I'm recording in early September. This is the episode for early September 2023. And I realized that as I was coming up with this list of 10 things that I wish I knew before I started a podcast, that I have implemented a lot of these. And this is one that I definitely implemented. Back in the spring, I did so many podcast interviews in preparation for the summer because I know that a lot of people end up rescheduling over the summer. And I know that I don't want to have to try to kick my kids out of the house during the summer. It is really hot and there's not a lot of places that they can go locally to cool off or be inside other than the library and things like that. So the idea of trying to get them out of the house so I could record podcast episodes was just a lot. And so I batch recorded a ton of episodes in early spring, and I actually had episodes all the way through, at this point, the end of October, where I will not have to have any guest episodes, and I shifted to have almost exclusively guest episodes over the summer because I had so many guests lined up and so many interviews recorded, and I want to make sure that I use those. So planning and batching can make or break your podcast. It can help so much with being able to create a podcast that is going to work for you and allow you to continue to show up for your audience every single week, every single other week, however the cadence of your episode releases. So those are 10 things that I wish I knew before I started a podcast. I would love to hear from you. Send me a DM on Instagram and tell me what is one thing that you wish that you knew before you started your podcast. And if you're struggling with any of these things that we talked about, maybe you're at a point where you're starting to fall off with your show, let's book a strategy session. I would love to talk through some strategies that you can do to really improve your podcast, make it work better for you, and potentially generate leads with your show. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.